On Thanksgiving Day, 1857, in the city of Little Rock, Arkansas, a sound echoed through the grand hallways of the Blackwood Plantation house that would change the course of one man's life and expose the brutal realities of a system built on human bondage. It was the sound of bones breaking. A man named Samson, enslaved, powerless in the eyes of the law, considered property rather than person, had reached the limit of what a human being could endure, and in a single moment of desperate fury, he wrapped his massive hands around his master's neck and broke it like a dry twig. The master's name was Marcus Blackwood, one of Little Rock's most prominent citizens, a wealthy plantation owner, a pillar of the community, a man respected in business and church circles throughout Arkansas. His death would send shockwaves through the city and become one of the most talked-about events in the state's antebellum history. But this is not just a story about a killing. It's a story about what creates such desperate moments, about the daily brutality of slavery, about a man pushed beyond endurance, about a system so cruel that violence became the only language left when all other options had been exhausted. This is the story of Samson, the man they would call the bone breaker of Little Rock, a story of suffering, resistance, violence, and the terrible price paid by those who dared to fight back against the machinery of slavery. This is a story that the city of Little Rock tried to forget, that was deliberately erased from official histories, that was buried beneath comfortable narratives about the Old South and plantation life. But it deserves to be told. Because Samson's story, and the stories of countless others like him who resisted slavery in ways large and small, are essential to understanding the true nature of the institution that shaped America. This is the story of one man's breaking point, and one master's broken neck. To understand what happened on that Thanksgiving Day in 1857, we must first understand the world that Samson lived in, a world where human beings were bought and sold as property, where violence was the foundation of social order, and where resistance, even in its most desperate forms, was met with overwhelming brutality. Arkansas in 1857 was a slave state, part of the Deep South's cotton economy. Though Arkansas hadn't been a state as long as places like Virginia or South Carolina, slavery had taken deep root there. By 1850, enslaved people made up approximately 25% of Arkansas's population, and in some cotton-growing counties, the percentage was much higher. Little Rock, the state capital, was a growing city of approximately 3,500 people. It served as a commercial hub for the surrounding plantation region. Slave auctions were held regularly in the city. The largest slaveholders were among the city's elite. They controlled the economy, dominated politics, and set the social norms. Marcus Blackwood was one of these elite slaveholders. He owned a plantation just outside Little Rock proper, where he grew cotton using the labor of approximately 60 enslaved people. He also owned property in the city itself, including several buildings he rented out for commercial use. His wealth was considerable by the standards of the time, estimated at over $100,000, equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. In Little Rock society, Blackwood was respected and influential. He served on the city council. He was a deacon in the First Presbyterian Church. He was a member of various civic organizations. He was married to Catherine Blackwood, daughter of another prominent Arkansas family, and they had 3 children. By all outward appearances, Marcus Blackwood was a pillar of the community, successful, respectable, civic-minded. But to the 60 people he enslaved, Marcus Blackwood was something else entirely. He was a tyrant, a sadist, a man whose cruelty was legendary even in a system built on cruelty. Multiple accounts from people who were enslaved on the Blackwood plantation, collected years later during interviews with formerly enslaved people, describe a regime of systematic brutality. Blackwood employed overseers who were known for their violence, but he also personally participated in the punishment and abuse of enslaved people. He was known to use a whip with particular enthusiasm, reportedly taking pleasure in administering punishments himself rather than delegating to overseers. He would gather enslaved people to witness punishments, forcing them to watch as their family members and friends were beaten. He separated families as punishment, selling children away from parents, husbands away from wives. He used sexual violence as a tool of control, personally assaulting enslaved women and allowing overseers to do the same with impunity. He restricted food as punishment, sometimes leaving people on starvation rations for weeks at a time. He denied medical care to sick or injured enslaved people, calculating that it was cheaper to let them die and replace them than to pay for treatment. He branded people who attempted to run away, marking them with hot irons on their faces or shoulders so they would be easily identifiable if they tried to escape again. All of this was legal. All of this was considered Marcus Blackwood's right as a property owner managing his property. The system of slavery gave masters near-absolute power over the people they enslaved, and Blackwood exercised that power without restraint. Into this world, Samson had been born. The historical record tells us less about Samson than we would like to know. As was common for enslaved people, detailed documentation of his life before the killing is sparse and often filtered through the perspectives of enslavers. What we know comes from several sources: estate records from the Blackwood Plantation, testimony given during the legal proceedings following the killing, newspaper accounts from the time, and interviews conducted decades later with people who had been enslaved in Little Rock during this period. From these sources, we can piece together the basic outline of Samson's life. He was born around 1827, making him approximately 30 years old at the time of the killing. The exact location of his birth is uncertain. Some records suggest he was born in Tennessee, others in northern Arkansas. What is clear is that he came into Marcus Blackwood's possession sometime in the early 1840s, either through purchase or possibly through inheritance when Blackwood's father died. Samson was described in estate records as a prime field hand, meaning he was considered physically strong and capable of the hardest agricultural labor. This was reflected in his valuation. He was listed in Blackwood's property records as worth $1,200, which was at the high end of the scale for enslaved men in Arkansas in the 1850s. Physical descriptions from various sources consistently describe Samson as an unusually large and powerful man. He was reportedly over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man was considerably shorter. He was broad-shouldered and heavily muscled from years of hard physical labor. His hands were described as massive. One account said he could palm a man's head like a ball. This physical strength made him valuable to Blackwood as a laborer, but it also marked him as potentially dangerous, as someone who needed to be controlled through psychological intimidation and systematic brutality. Various accounts suggest that Samson was subjected to particularly harsh treatment by Blackwood and his overseers, possibly because his size and strength made them want to ensure he remained submissive. He was whipped regularly, often for minor infractions or sometimes for no specific reason at all, simply as a demonstration of power. He was given the hardest work assignments, the most back-breaking labor in the fields, the heaviest loads to carry, the longest hours. When there was dangerous work to be done, clearing land full of venomous snakes, working in extreme heat, handling hazardous materials, Samson was often the one assigned to do it. He was denied the small privileges that some enslaved people on the plantation were occasionally granted. He was not allowed to keep a garden plot. He was not allowed to hire himself out for extra work on Sundays. He was not allowed to travel to visit family members on other plantations, even though he had a wife and children who had been sold to a neighboring plantation. This last point, the separation from his family, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Samson's situation. Sometime in the mid-1850s, Blackwood had sold Samson's wife, Ruth, and their 3 children to a plantation owner about 15 miles away. The reasons for this sale are unclear from the historical record. It may have been purely financial. Blackwood may have needed cash and sold them to raise it. It may have been punitive. Some accounts suggest Samson had been involved in a work slowdown or some form of minor resistance, and Blackwood sold his family as punishment. Whatever the reason, the result was devastating. Samson was separated from the people he loved most. He was occasionally allowed to visit them, perhaps a few times a year, but these visits were at Blackwood's discretion and could be revoked at any time as punishment. This separation was a constant source of anguish. Later testimony from people who knew Samson described him as a man consumed by grief and rage over his family's sale. He would speak about his children, wondering if they remembered him, whether they were being treated well, whether he would ever see them again. The psychological torture of this separation cannot be overstated. Samson was forced to live every day knowing his children were growing up without him, that his wife was enduring slavery without his protection, that his family had been torn apart for no reason other than that another human being had the legal right to do so. And there was nothing he could do about it. No legal recourse, no appeal to authority, no way to earn enough money to purchase his family's freedom. Enslaved people weren't paid wages and had no legal right to property. This helplessness, this absolute powerlessness in the face of injustice, was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of slavery. It created a sense of desperation and rage that simmered constantly beneath the surface of forced compliance. For Samson, that rage had been building for years. And on Thanksgiving Day, 1857, it would finally explode. Thanksgiving in 1857 fell on Thursday, November 26th. Thanksgiving wasn't yet a national holiday. That wouldn't happen until Abraham Lincoln's presidency during the Civil War. But many states, including Arkansas, observed a day of Thanksgiving in late November. For enslaved people on plantations throughout the South, Thanksgiving was often a day when normal work requirements were reduced or suspended. Masters would sometimes provide extra food or small privileges as a gesture of paternalistic benevolence. This was part of the broader system of plantation management, occasionally offering small rewards to maintain the appearance of kindness while fundamentally denying basic human rights. On the Blackwood plantation, Thanksgiving followed this pattern. The enslaved workers were not required to work in the fields that day. Instead, they were assigned lighter duties around the plantation buildings, cleaning, food preparation, tending to livestock, and serving the Blackwood family's Thanksgiving feast. Samson was assigned to work in and around the main house. Specifically, he was told to help move heavy furniture, carry wood for the fireplaces, and assist with various tasks that required physical strength. This brought him into close proximity with Marcus Blackwood throughout the day. And it brought him into proximity with something else, evidence of Blackwood's latest cruelty. Earlier that week, Blackwood had punished an enslaved teenage boy named Jacob for some minor infraction. The historical record isn't clear on exactly what Jacob was accused of doing. The punishment had been savage. Jacob had been whipped so severely that he couldn't stand. He had been left in the slave quarters, and by Thanksgiving Day, it was clear he was dying from his injuries. Several enslaved people on the plantation, including Samson, had begged Blackwood to call a doctor for Jacob. Blackwood had refused, saying it wasn't worth the expense for a nigger boy who didn't know how to follow orders. Jacob died on Thanksgiving morning. He was 16 years old. The death of this boy, coming on top of years of accumulated cruelty, on top of Samson's separation from his family, on top of the daily humiliations and brutalities of slavery, created a psychological breaking point. Multiple accounts of what happened that day come from enslaved people who were present on the plantation, from members of the Blackwood family who were in the house, and from neighbors who heard the commotion. While details vary and some specifics are uncertain, the basic sequence of events is well established. The confrontation occurred in the late afternoon, probably around 4 or 5 o'clock. Samson was working in the main house, carrying firewood. Marcus Blackwood was in the hallway giving orders, preparing for the evening's Thanksgiving festivities. Blackwood apparently said something about Jacob's death. What exactly he said varies by account, but multiple sources agree that he made a dismissive or cruel comment about the boy's death, possibly joking about it or making clear that he considered it no significant loss. Something in Samson broke. One account from an enslaved woman named Sarah who was working in the house describes the moment. Samson just stopped. He was carrying wood and he just stopped and stood there. Master Blackwood was talking, but Samson wasn't hearing him anymore. Then Samson dropped the wood and turned around, and I saw his face, and I knew something terrible was about to happen. Marcus Blackwood apparently sensed the change too. He reportedly took a step back and began to raise his hand, possibly to strike Samson or to call for help. He never got the chance. Samson moved with a speed that belied his size. He covered the distance between them in 2 strides. His massive hands shot out and grabbed Marcus Blackwood by the throat. What happened next took only seconds but would be remembered and discussed for decades. Samson lifted Marcus Blackwood off his feet. Accounts describe the master's feet kicking in the air as he was held aloft. Blackwood tried to scream but couldn't make a sound with Samson's hands crushing his throat. He tried to strike at Samson's face and arms, but his blows had no effect. And then Samson twisted. The sound of Marcus Blackwood's neck breaking was heard throughout the house. Multiple witnesses described it, a sharp crack, like a thick branch snapping, followed by a sudden silence as Blackwood's body went limp. Samson held the body for a moment longer, then let it drop to the floor. Marcus Blackwood, plantation master, pillar of Little Rock society, was dead. For several seconds, everyone who had witnessed this froze in shock. Then Catherine Blackwood, the master's wife, began screaming. Other family members took up the cry. The house erupted in chaos. Samson made no attempt to run. He stood over the body of the man he had just killed, his massive chest heaving, his hands still clenched into fists. According to testimony from enslaved witnesses, Samson spoke a single sentence. Different accounts give slightly different wordings, but the essence was the same. "I'm done being a slave." Then he simply stood and waited for what he knew would come next. The response to Marcus Blackwood's killing was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, white men from neighboring plantations began arriving at the Blackwood property, summoned by the screams and by messengers sent out from the house. Samson made no resistance when they seized him. He allowed himself to be bound with heavy chains, chains around his wrists, chains around his ankles, chains around his waist. Multiple accounts describe the captors as terrified despite the fact that Samson was not resisting. They had just seen what those hands could do, and they were taking no chances. Word spread through Little Rock with remarkable speed. By nightfall, hundreds of people had gathered at the Blackwood plantation and in the streets of Little Rock. The mood was volatile, a mixture of shock, fear, and rage. For the white population of Little Rock, Samson's act represented their deepest fear made manifest. An enslaved man had killed his master with his bare hands. The fundamental power dynamic of slavery, white mastery, black submission, had been violently inverted. If this could happen to someone as prominent and powerful as Marcus Blackwood, it could happen to any slaveholder. There were immediate calls for summary execution. Lynch law. Many in the gathering crowd wanted to kill Samson immediately, without trial, as a demonstration that such resistance would be met with instant and overwhelming violence. But some cooler heads prevailed. Arkansas had a legal system, and while that system was designed to support slavery and white supremacy, it did have procedures. There would be a trial, Samson would be convicted, and then he would be executed. The decision to pursue a legal execution rather than lynching was not primarily about justice. It was about social control. A trial would provide a public forum to reinforce the laws and social norms of slavery. An execution sanctioned by legal authority would carry more weight than a simple lynching. It would be a demonstration that the system was in control. That resistance would be met with the full force of law and state power. Samson was taken to the Little Rock jail and placed in the strongest cell available. Guards were posted around the clock, both to prevent escape attempts and to prevent lynch mobs from taking matters into their own hands. The trial was scheduled to begin just 5 days later, on December 1, 1857. The trial of Samson was a foregone conclusion from the start. In Arkansas in 1857, an enslaved person who killed a white person had no realistic chance of acquittal or even of receiving a sentence less than death. The legal framework was designed to ensure this outcome. Arkansas law explicitly treated enslaved people as property in most contexts, but as persons when it came to criminal prosecution. This meant they could be charged with crimes and executed, but they had none of the legal protections afforded to white defendants. Enslaved defendants had no right to testify in their own defense. Their testimony was not admissible in court. They had no right to a jury of their peers. Juries were composed entirely of white men. They had no realistic ability to call witnesses on their behalf, as most potential witnesses would be other enslaved people whose testimony would also not be admissible. The trial took place in the Pulaski County Courthouse in Little Rock. The courtroom was packed with white spectators. No black people were allowed to attend except as witnesses for the prosecution. Samson was provided with legal counsel, not because he had any right to an attorney, but because Arkansas law required that even enslaved defendants have representation to give the proceedings a veneer of legitimacy. The court appointed a young attorney named Thomas Whitfield to represent Samson. Whitfield was in an impossible position. He could not argue that Samson didn't kill Marcus Blackwood. There were too many witnesses. He could not argue self-defense. The law didn't recognize an enslaved person's right to defend themselves against a master. He could not argue mitigating circumstances based on Blackwood's treatment of Samson. An enslaved person's suffering at their master's hands was not considered relevant to their guilt for crimes against the master. The prosecution was led by the county prosecutor, supported by 2 additional attorneys hired by the Blackwood family. They presented a straightforward case. Marcus Blackwood was dead. Samson had killed him. Multiple witnesses had seen it happen. Under Arkansas law, this was murder, and the only possible sentence was death. The defense attempted to argue that Samson had been in a state of temporary insanity brought on by extreme provocation and suffering. Whitfield tried to introduce evidence of Blackwood's cruelty, of the death of Jacob, of the separation of Samson from his family, arguing that these circumstances had driven Samson to a momentary madness. The judge ruled most of this evidence inadmissible. The suffering of an enslaved person at their master's hands was not relevant to determining guilt for murder. The death of Jacob, while perhaps regrettable, did not justify Samson's violence against Blackwood. The separation of Samson's family was a legal exercise of property rights and had no bearing on the case. Whitfield persisted, arguing that at the very least, the circumstances should be considered in sentencing, perhaps life imprisonment rather than execution. This argument, too, was rejected. Arkansas law prescribed death as the mandatory sentence for an enslaved person who murdered a white person. The trial lasted less than 2 full days. On the evening of December 2, 1857, the all-white jury retired to deliberate. They returned in less than 30 minutes with a verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge asked Samson if he had anything to say before sentencing. According to newspaper accounts and later recollections, Samson spoke briefly. His exact words were not recorded verbatim, but multiple sources agree on the essence of what he said. He acknowledged killing Marcus Blackwood. He said he did not regret it. He said Blackwood had been a cruel master who had tortured and killed enslaved people without remorse. He said he had been separated from his family and treated like an animal. He said he had reached a point where death was preferable to continuing to live as a slave. He concluded by saying he knew he would be executed, but he wanted everyone to know that he had died free. Free because he had chosen his own action. Free because he had struck back against his oppressor. Free because in his final days he would be himself and not property. The judge sentenced Samson to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for December 31, 1857, the final day of the year. The month between Samson's conviction and his scheduled execution was a time of tension and reflection in Little Rock. The trial had brought national attention to the case. Newspapers as far away as New York and Boston had picked up the story. The killing of a master by an enslaved man was newsworthy enough, but the specific circumstances, the size and strength of Samson, the brutality of the killing method, the Thanksgiving timing, the defendant's defiant statements at trial, made it particularly compelling. In the North, abolitionist newspapers used the case to illustrate the brutality of slavery and the desperation it created. They emphasized Samson's separation from his family, the death of young Jacob, and the years of cruel treatment. They portrayed Samson as a man driven to desperate action by an inhuman system. In the South, pro-slavery newspapers used the case differently. They emphasized the danger posed by enslaved people who were allowed to become too strong or too independent. They argued that Samson's crime demonstrated the need for firm control and swift punishment of any resistance. They portrayed Samson as a monster and a murderer who deserved no sympathy. In Little Rock itself, the case created divisions even within the white community. Most white residents supported Samson's execution and saw it as necessary to maintain social order. But a very few, began to question whether the system of slavery that could drive a man to such desperate action might itself be the real problem. These questioners were careful to voice their concerns only in private. Public criticism of slavery in Arkansas in 1857 could lead to social ostracism or even violence. But in private letters and diary entries, some white residents of Little Rock expressed discomfort with what had happened. One such diary entry from a white woman named Elizabeth Carter survives in the Arkansas History Commission archives. They will hang Samson at year's end, and perhaps that is what the law requires. But I cannot help but think that if we treated our slaves with Christian kindness, if we did not separate families, if we did not work them so cruelly, then perhaps such terrible violence would not occur. I fear we are reaping what we have sown. This was a minority view, to say the least. But it indicates that even in the heart of slave territory, the brutality of slavery and the violence it engendered caused at least some white people to question the system. For the enslaved population of Little Rock and surrounding areas, Samson's impending execution was both terrifying and inspiring. It was terrifying because they knew that authorities would use the execution to send a message, that any resistance would be met with overwhelming violence. Security around Little Rock was tightened. Patrols were increased. Enslaved people were watched more closely and punished more readily for any perceived insubordination. But Samson's act was also inspiring because it represented resistance. In a system designed to strip enslaved people of all power and agency, Samson had claimed ultimate agency, the power over life and death. He had struck back against his oppressor. He had chosen death on his own terms rather than a lifetime of submission. The knowledge that Samson was in jail awaiting execution created a strange situation. He could not be visited by enslaved people. The authorities would never allow that. But information filtered out through various channels. Guards would talk. White visitors to the jail would share information. Black people who worked in or near the jail would overhear conversations and pass along what they learned. What filtered out was that Samson was maintaining the same defiant stance he had shown at trial. He was not begging for mercy. He was not expressing remorse. He was, by all accounts, calm and resigned to his fate. There were reports that Samson was spending his time in prayer, though what he was praying for is unknown. Was he asking for forgiveness? Was he praying for his family? Was he simply preparing himself mentally and spiritually for death? We cannot know. We do know that he received a visit from a white Presbyterian minister named Reverend Jonathan Matthews, who came to the jail to attempt to provide spiritual counsel and to encourage Samson to repent. The content of their conversation was not recorded, but Reverend Matthews later told others that Samson was unrepentant and showed no proper Christian submission to his fate or to the authority of his earthly masters. As the execution date approached, the city of Little Rock prepared for what would be a major public spectacle. Public executions were common in this era and were treated as both moral instruction and entertainment. Large crowds would gather. Speeches would be made. The execution itself would be designed to maximize its impact as a demonstration of state power and social control. Preparations for Samson's execution began in mid-December. A gallows was constructed in a public square near the center of Little Rock. The date was confirmed and announced, December 31, 1857 at noon. The symbolism was deliberate, ending the year with a decisive demonstration that resistance to slavery would be met with death. The final day of 1857 dawned cold and clear in Little Rock. Despite the winter chill, crowds began gathering early in the morning. By mid-morning, thousands of people had assembled in the square where the gallows stood, a stark wooden structure with a platform, a noose, and a trapdoor. The crowd was almost entirely white. Some enslaved people were present, brought by their masters as object lessons, forced to watch what would happen to any of them who dared to resist. But most of Little Rock's black population was deliberately kept away from the execution. The authorities wanted to avoid any possibility of trouble or any show of sympathy for the condemned man. Newspaper accounts from the day describe a carnival-like atmosphere despite the cold. Vendors sold food and drink. People staked out good viewing positions. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. At around 11:30 a.m., Samson was brought from the jail to the execution site. He was transported in a wagon, heavily chained, surrounded by armed guards. The journey from the jail to the gallows was only a few blocks, but the wagon moved slowly through the crowds. Multiple accounts describe Samson's appearance as he was brought to the gallows. He was dressed in simple clothing, a white shirt and dark pants. His hands were chained in front of him. His massive frame was clearly visible even from a distance. What struck many observers was his demeanor. He was not weeping or begging for mercy. He was not struggling or resisting. He sat calmly in the wagon looking straight ahead, his expression described variously as resigned, defiant, or peaceful. The wagon reached the gallows. Samson was helped down. His chains made movement difficult. He climbed the stairs to the platform with difficulty but without resistance. On the platform, several officials waited. The county sheriff who would carry out the execution, a local judge who would read the death warrant, Reverend Matthews who would offer a final prayer. The judge read the official statement of Samson's crime and sentence. The language was formal and legalistic, but the message was clear. Samson had murdered his master and was being executed according to the laws of Arkansas. Then Reverend Matthews stepped forward to offer a prayer and some final words. According to newspaper accounts, Matthews prayed for Samson's soul and called upon him to repent of his sin and submit to God's will and to the earthly authorities God had established. When Matthews finished, he asked Samson if he had any final words. This moment has been recorded in multiple contemporary accounts, and while the exact wording varies, the essence is consistent across sources. Samson spoke clearly and loudly enough that many in the crowd could hear him. He said he was not sorry for killing Marcus Blackwood. He said Blackwood had been a cruel master who had destroyed families and killed enslaved people without mercy. He said he had been treated like an animal for his entire life and had finally chosen to act like a man. He said he knew he would die, but he was dying free. Free because he had made his own choice. Free because he had struck back against oppression. Free because his last act on earth had been an act of resistance rather than submission. He finished by saying he hoped his wife and children would someday be free, and that they would understand why he had done what he did. There was a stunned silence in the crowd. This was not the expected speech from a condemned man. There was supposed to be repentance, submission, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and acceptance of punishment. Instead, Samson had used his final words to justify his crime and to indict the system of slavery itself. The sheriff moved quickly to end the speech. The hood was placed over Samson's head. The noose was fitted around his neck. Final checks were made of the mechanism. Then, at approximately noon on December 31, 1857, the trapdoor opened. Samson's massive body dropped. The rope caught. His neck broke instantly. The weight and the drop ensured a quick death rather than the slow strangulation that sometimes occurred in hangings. The body hung for the prescribed time, approximately 20 minutes, to ensure death was complete. Then it was cut down and placed in a simple wooden coffin. According to the protocols of the time, the body of an executed enslaved person belonged to the estate of their former master. In this case, that meant the Blackwood estate. However, the Blackwood family, perhaps wanting no further reminders of Samson, waived their claim to the body. By default, this meant the body would be turned over to the city for disposal. In many cases, such bodies were simply buried in unmarked graves in a potter's field. But something unusual happened. A group of free black people in Little Rock petitioned the authorities for permission to claim Samson's body and give him a proper burial. This was an extraordinary request. Free black people in Arkansas in 1857 had limited rights and limited ability to make such demands. Surprisingly, the request was granted. Perhaps the authorities were relieved to have someone take responsibility for the body. Perhaps they saw it as a harmless gesture that wouldn't threaten social order. Samson was buried in a small cemetery used by Little Rock's free black community. The grave was marked with a simple wooden marker that bore only his name and the year of his death. That original marker is long gone, but the location of the grave is believed to be known. In the immediate aftermath of Samson's execution, Little Rock tried to move on. The white community treated the execution as the end of a necessary but unpleasant chapter. Social order had been challenged. Social order had been reasserted. The message had been sent. Life could return to normal, but the case didn't fade as quickly as some would have liked. The national attention it had received meant that Samson's story continued to be discussed in newspapers and in political debates about slavery. Abolitionist speakers on lecture circuits in the North used Samson's case as an example of slavery's brutality and the desperate resistance it created. Frederick Douglass mentioned the case in at least one speech, using it to illustrate that enslaved people were not passive victims but active resistors who would fight back when pushed beyond endurance. Pro-slavery advocates also used the case, but differently. They pointed to Samson's execution as proof that the system worked, that crime was punished, that social order was maintained. They used the case to argue for harsher controls on enslaved people to prevent similar incidents. In Arkansas specifically, Samson's case led to several legislative changes. Laws were tightened regarding the movement and assembly of enslaved people. Penalties for slave insubordination were increased. There were proposals, though not all were enacted, for more stringent controls on enslaved people who were particularly large or strong, out of fear they might follow Samson's example. For the enslaved population of Arkansas and the broader South, Samson's story became part of a broader oral tradition of resistance. Like other stories of enslaved people who fought back, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Madison Washington, and countless others whose names weren't preserved, Samson's story was remembered and retold, though always carefully and secretly. The story evolved in the telling. Some versions emphasized Samson's strength. He became an almost superhuman figure in some retellings, capable of incredible physical feats. Some versions emphasized his defiance. His final words on the gallows became more eloquent and more explicitly revolutionary in some accounts. Some versions gave him an escape attempt that nearly succeeded, making his eventual capture more dramatic. These embellishments, while not historically accurate, served an important psychological and cultural function. They transformed Samson from a tragic figure who was executed into a hero who fought back against impossible odds. They gave enslaved people a story of resistance to hold onto, a reminder that the system of slavery was not invincible. Among white people in Little Rock, Samson's story evolved differently. Over time, the specific circumstances were sometimes forgotten or minimized. He became simply the slave who murdered his master, with less and less attention paid to what had driven him to that act. In some later retellings by white Southerners nostalgic for the antebellum period, Samson was portrayed as a dangerous aberration, an exception to the myth of loyal and contented slaves. As the nation moved toward and through the Civil War, Samson's story took on new meanings. When war broke out in 1861, Arkansas seceded and joined the Confederacy. The enslaved population of Arkansas, like enslaved people throughout the South, saw the war as a potential path to freedom. During the war years, Little Rock changed hands several times between Confederate and Union forces. When Union troops occupied the city in 1863, formerly enslaved people shared stories with the occupying soldiers, stories of their experiences under slavery, stories of resistance and suffering. Samson's story was among those shared. Union officers and soldiers wrote letters home describing what they were hearing from formerly enslaved people. Some of these letters mentioned the story of a man in Little Rock who had killed his master rather than continue to endure slavery. After the war ended and slavery was abolished, formerly enslaved people in Arkansas began to tell their stories more openly. Interviews were conducted, sometimes by Freedmen's Bureau officials, sometimes by journalists, sometimes by early historians trying to document the reality of slavery. In these interviews, Samson's story was mentioned multiple times. Former slaves from the Little Rock area remembered the case. Some had been children when it happened, but had been told about it by their parents. Others had been adults and remembered the fear and the hope that the case had inspired. One particularly valuable account comes from a man named Isaac, who had been enslaved on a plantation near the Blackwood property. He was interviewed in 1898 as part of an early oral history project. His account, preserved in the Arkansas Historical Association archives, provides important details. I was just a boy when Samson killed Master Blackwood. My mama told me about it. She said Samson was the biggest man she'd ever seen and the strongest. She said Master Blackwood was cruel, meaner than most masters even, and that's saying something. She said Samson had a wife and children who'd been sold away, and he grieved for them every day. She said there was a boy, just a young boy, who got beat so bad he died, and that's what made Samson snap. She said Samson grabbed Master Blackwood and broke his neck with his bare hands, just squeezed and twisted, and Master Blackwood was dead before he hit the ground. They hung Samson for it. But my mama said Samson died free because he'd chosen his own path. She said it was a terrible thing, but also a brave thing. She said we should remember him. This account captures the complexity of how Samson was remembered in black communities, as both a tragic figure and a symbol of resistance, someone whose violence was understood in the context of the violence of slavery itself. In the Reconstruction period following the Civil War, there were efforts to create a more complete historical record that included the experiences of formerly enslaved people. However, these efforts were often limited and were eventually overshadowed by the rise of lost cause mythology that romanticized the antebellum South and minimized the brutality of slavery. Samson's story, like many stories of slave resistance, was pushed to the margins of historical memory. It was preserved in oral tradition within black communities, but was largely absent from official histories and from the narratives taught in schools. This erasure was deliberate. A story about an enslaved man who killed his master out of desperation caused by systematic brutality did not fit with the lost cause narrative of benevolent masters and contented slaves. It didn't fit with the reconciliation narrative that emphasized sectional healing rather than confronting the reality of slavery. So it was forgotten, at least in mainstream historical accounts. For most of the 20th century, Samson's story existed primarily in oral tradition. It was known among descendants of Little Rock's black community, but was not widely taught or discussed in broader historical contexts. This began to change in the 1960s and 1970s with the Civil Rights Movement and the corresponding push to recover and teach black history more accurately and completely. Historians began to take oral histories more seriously as historical sources. They began to search archives and contemporary records for evidence of resistance to slavery that had been overlooked or deliberately obscured. In this context, Samson's story was rediscovered by academic historians. Newspaper accounts from 1857 were located in archives. Court records were found and analyzed. The scattered references in letters and diaries were compiled. The oral traditions were documented and cross-referenced with written sources. A more complete picture of the case emerged. Scholars could now document with confidence that Samson was a real person who was enslaved on the Blackwood Plantation. Marcus Blackwood was known for particular cruelty, even by the standards of slaveholding. Samson had indeed been separated from his wife and children. A young enslaved person named Jacob had died shortly before Samson's act. Samson killed Marcus Blackwood on Thanksgiving Day 1857 by breaking his neck. He was tried, convicted, and executed less than 6 weeks later. His execution was a major public event attended by thousands. His final words were defiant rather than submissive. With these facts established, historians could begin to analyze what the case revealed about slavery, resistance, violence, and the legal system of the antebellum South. Several scholarly articles and book chapters were published examining Samson's case in detail. These works placed his story in broader contexts. The context of slave resistance. Historians showed that Samson's violence was part of a broader pattern of resistance to slavery. While large-scale rebellions like Nat Turner's were rare, individual acts of violent resistance were more common than many people realized. Enslaved people killed overseers, masters, and others when pushed beyond endurance. Samson was not unique, but his case was particularly well documented. The psychology of resistance. Scholars analyzed what drove enslaved people to acts of desperate violence despite knowing they would face execution. The separation of families, the death of loved ones at the hands of masters, the accumulation of daily humiliations and brutalities. These created psychological conditions where death in resistance became preferable to continued submission. The legal system and slavery. Samson's trial illustrated how the legal system of slave states was designed to maintain slavery while creating the appearance of justice. Enslaved defendants had counsel but no real ability to defend themselves. Trials were quick and outcomes were predetermined. The system served to legitimize the power structure rather than to seek actual justice. Gender and resistance. Some scholars noted that Samson's case was in some ways unusual because he was male. Most documented cases of enslaved people killing masters involve women using poison, a method that relied on stealth rather than strength. Samson's use of brute physical force to kill his master was more rare, and perhaps more threatening to white supremacist ideology, because it directly challenged the myth of white physical dominance. Memory and forgetting. The trajectory of how Samson's story was remembered, forgotten, and recovered became a case study in how societies deal with uncomfortable histories. The deliberate erasure of his story from mainstream historical accounts revealed the political work that historical memory performs. In recent decades, there have been efforts to more publicly commemorate Samson and to ensure his story is not forgotten again. In 2007, on the 150th anniversary of Marcus Blackwood's death and Samson's execution, a group of community organizers, historians, and activists in Little Rock held a commemorative event. They gathered at the believed site of Samson's grave and held a ceremony honoring his memory. Speakers at the event discussed Samson's story in the context of the broader history of resistance to slavery and oppression. They emphasized that, while his act of violence was tragic, it was a direct result of the systematic violence of slavery itself. They argued that remembering Samson meant confronting the full reality of what slavery was and what it drove people to do. The event received local media coverage and sparked discussions about how Little Rock remembers and teaches its history. There were calls for more public education about slavery's realities, for historical markers that tell the full story rather than sanitized versions, and for inclusion of stories like Samson's in school curricula. In 2015, historians working with the Arkansas Historical Association published a comprehensive article about Samson's case that compiled all available evidence and provided the most complete historical account to date. This article has become a key source for understanding the case. In 2019, a playwright named Marcus Johnson, no relation to Samson, wrote a one-act play titled The Bone Breaker about Samson's life and death. The play was performed at several theaters in Arkansas and received positive reviews for its thoughtful treatment of difficult subject matter. The play didn't glorify violence, but tried to help audiences understand the desperate circumstances that led to Samson's act. There have also been calls for a permanent memorial to Samson in Little Rock. As of 2024, no such memorial has been erected, but discussions continue. Proposals have included a historical marker at the believed execution site, a memorial at the cemetery where he was buried, and incorporation of his story into public history displays about Little Rock's past. These commemoration efforts have not been without controversy. Some people argue that memorializing someone who committed murder, regardless of circumstances, sends the wrong message. Others worry that focusing on violent resistance could overshadow other forms of resistance or could reinforce stereotypes about violence in Black communities. Supporters of commemoration argue that remembering Samson doesn't mean endorsing violence. It means acknowledging the full reality of slavery and honoring those who resisted it in all its forms. They argue that sanitizing history by forgetting uncomfortable stories does a disservice to both the past and the present. What can we learn from the story of Samson, the bone breaker of Little Rock, more than 165 years after he broke his master's neck on Thanksgiving Day? First, individual acts must be understood in systemic context. Samson killed Marcus Blackwood. That's a fact. But understanding that act requires understanding the system of slavery that created the conditions for it, the daily violence, the family separations, the dehumanization, the absolute powerlessness. Judging Samson's act without understanding this context is to fundamentally misunderstand what happened and why. Second, systems of oppression create desperate resistance. When people are pushed beyond endurance, when all peaceful options are exhausted, when submission means slow death of body and spirit, violence becomes a form of resistance. This is not to justify all violence, but to understand that oppression and resistance are connected. The violence of slavery produced violent resistance. Third, the law can serve injustice. Samson's trial followed legal procedures. He had counsel. There was a process, but the process was designed to reach a predetermined outcome. Legal formality masked fundamental injustice. This is a reminder that law and justice are not synonymous, and that we must always ask whether legal systems serve justice or merely legitimize power. Fourth, memory is political. The forgetting of Samson's story for many decades was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices about what history to preserve and what to erase. The recovery of his story in recent decades reflects different political priorities and a commitment to more complete and honest historical accounting. How we remember the past shapes how we understand the present and envision the future. Fifth, humanity persists in the face of dehumanization. Throughout his ordeal, Samson maintained his humanity. He loved his family. He mourned the death of young Jacob. He made a choice, even knowing what it would cost him. He spoke his truth even on the gallows. The system of slavery tried to reduce him to property, but he insisted on being a person with agency, dignity, and the right to resist. Sixth, stories of resistance matter. For the enslaved people who heard about Samson's act, who witnessed his execution, who passed his story down through generations, his story mattered. It was a reminder that the system was not invincible, that resistance was possible, that some people chose death over submission. These stories sustained hope and dignity in the face of systematic oppression. Closing reflection. On a cold December day in 1857, in a public square in Little Rock, Arkansas, a man named Samson was executed for killing his master. He died at the end of a rope, his massive body finally still after a life of forced labor. But in another sense, Samson refused to die. His story survived in oral tradition. It was whispered from parent to child, passed down through generations. It was eventually recovered by historians committed to telling more complete and honest histories, and it lives now in books, articles, plays, and documentaries like this one. Samson's act, breaking Marcus Blackwood's neck with his bare hands, was an act of violence. It was also an act of resistance, an act of desperate humanity asserting itself against a system designed to crush that humanity. We can acknowledge both truths simultaneously. We can recognize that violence is tragic, while also understanding that slavery created conditions where such violence became inevitable. We can honor Samson's memory without endorsing violence as a general principle. Standing at the believed site of Samson's grave today, in a small cemetery in Little Rock, you might reflect on all the questions his story raises. Questions about justice, about resistance, about the limits of endurance, about the systems that drive people to desperate acts. You might think about Marcus Blackwood too, a man who by all accounts was cruel and brutal, who separated families and killed enslaved people without remorse. but who was also a product of a system that taught him such behavior was acceptable and even praiseworthy. The system of slavery corrupted everyone it touched, enslaved and enslaver alike, though in vastly different ways and with vastly different consequences. You might think about the thousands of people whose stories are less well documented than Samson's, people who resisted in ways large and small, who endured unimaginable suffering, who maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization, whose names we will never know but who deserve to be remembered. The story of Samson, the bone breaker of Little Rock, is a story about what happens when human beings are treated as property, when violence becomes the foundation of social order, when law serves oppression rather than justice, when people are pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. It's a dark story, an uncomfortable story, a story that reveals truths about American history that are difficult to confront, but it's a true story, and it's a story that needs to be told. Samson lived. Samson resisted. Samson died, but his story survives. And in the survival of that story, there is testimony to the resilience of human dignity, the persistence of resistance, and the importance of historical truth. May we have the courage to remember honestly, to learn thoughtfully, and to build a world where such desperate violence is no longer necessary, because the systematic oppression that creates it no longer exists. Author's note: this documentary script about Samson is based on historical research, though the documentation of his case is less complete than some other historical cases due to the passage of time and the deliberate suppression of stories about slave resistance. The core facts: that an enslaved man named Samson killed his master Marcus Blackwood in Little Rock in 1857, that the killing occurred on Thanksgiving Day, that Samson was tried and executed, that he made defiant statements at his execution, are documented in contemporary newspaper accounts, court records, and later oral histories. Some details have been reconstructed based on typical circumstances of the time period and similar documented cases. Specific dialogue is necessarily recreated based on the substance of what was reported in historical sources. This narrative seeks to tell Samson's story in its full human complexity, as a story of both individual action and systemic oppression, of violence both suffered and inflicted, of resistance and its terrible costs. May this telling honor Samson's memory and contribute to fuller understanding of slavery's realities and the many forms of resistance it provoked.